fact that how much this nation, this military, this world has changed since Pearl Harbor. So we have a tremendous group up here today to talk about those things. We have Doug Beck, he's the Director of Defense Innovation Unit and Senior Advisor to the Secretary of Defense. Ms. Michelle Flournoy, oops, I have my list here wrong. Ms. Michelle Flournoy, co-founder and managing partner of West Exec Advisors and the former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, and General Brian Fenton, commander of U.S. Special Operations Command, who I have a feeling is going to be our interesting and joke maker up here today, so we'll try to keep him in line. I do want to talk about future challenges, but because we're the first panel and we have a four-star general up here, I do want to ask about one little bit of news that we had this week. Senator Tuberville announcing that he was going to lift the hold on most of the nominations. I'm just curious, you know, over these last several months, while the nominees have been held up, has that had an impact on Special Operations Command? And if so, can you tell us what that's been?
Yeah, I can. Courtney, thank you. First of all, good morning, everybody, and really appreciate being here, and certainly with great friends, Michelle and Doug. So first of all, I'd say we're very grateful that this hold's been lifted, and we can get back to doing the business of the department in a really complex and complicated world, and that's changed significantly even in the last 10 years. And I think, as many have talked about, certainly is going to be even more challenging in the next decisive decade and even the next 1 to 2 years ahead, which will be really important. So you'd want us back in the business of predictability in the department with leaders in the right places and certainly getting after their tasks and remit the Secretary and the President have given your Department of Defense. So it has impacted that. There's been a lot of folks acting in positions, but not really able to make the decisions that would carry an organization on for 5, 10 years out. I think it's really important, and it's important to everybody in this room and whatever business or academia or whatever you do, you know that having a vision and being able to move an organization is really important. So we're back to that business, and we're grateful. Though there is still some work to do, still some teammates that I think are being held up, and we hope that'll be worked fairly quickly. I would say on the family front that I hope has certainly been heard by everybody in this room. That's had a really tremendous impact in a not so good way, in a bad way. You think about families who think they're going to move, go to a new location, you have schools, you have organizations to be a part of, friends to leave and new friends to make, and family members and spouses that would also have employment and have to get certificates in new states or even across the world, and that's all been held up and it's been very hard for a lot of families, and I think that thankfully we'll now be able to get back to business. So I'll just end with, we're grateful this mostly, there's still work to do, but that the hold's been lifted and we can get back to doing the business of the department, which would be to be forward and certainly defend the nation.
Great.
Thank you for that.
So I want to talk about current challenges. What are the biggest threats? And I'm going to go down the line here. General Fenton, starting with you. Sorry, I keep putting you on the spot already, but...
You told me I could tell some jokes.
Yeah, you can tell some jokes, believe me. What are some of the biggest threats that you're seeing right now?
Yeah, thank you. I think before I talk about the threats, and I'll talk if you're okay, both operationally and because we're on a tech and a transformation panel, I'll hit that as well. I would say that to do that, your Special Operations Command team, and for everybody out here, gets an opportunity to see the world globally. We are a global combatant command that has an opportunity to see the world on any given day through the eyes of 6,000 teammates, SOCOM teammates that are deployed in 80 countries across the world. They're a small part of the 70,000 Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine, and Space Force now Special Operations teammates. And I think they have an opportunity because they work in many domains. They work in the air domain, the land domain, space and cyber domains, and the maritime, to see the world, as I like to think about it, from seabed to space and from fiber to cyber. They really have a good optic on the things that I'll tell you now that we're seeing. We're seeing the PRC compete globally in this world. And not only bound by Indo-PACOM. They're certainly in, as we've had the chance very recently to travel to South America and Africa, they're in South America and Africa, wielding their elements of power, diplomatic, economic, and some level of information. Probably more the military piece of that in the Indo-Pacific. We're also seeing Russia, not just bound to Ukraine and the travesties that they're wreaking there, and certainly the unfortunate events against the Ukrainian people, but they're also in other parts of Europe, as I think all here know, and as well in Africa, in the north and west. And you, Courtney, we were glad to see you with our teammates in Niger. You've seen what that looks like in some small part in Mali, Niger, and Mauritania, and where Russia appears either through its paramilitary piece or even in their Ministry of Defense. I think we also see Russia in Libya. And so they're not bound geographically just to the European continent, so they're competing there. On top of that, the other challenges of violent extremism. ISIS and Al-Qaeda and even Al-Shabaab, I think each day look to regain their footing. And even though there's been a large amount of work done over the years with not only Special Operations Command, but the whole of our U.S. government and partners and allies to rip those networks apart and keep them at bay from certainly our homeland and partners and allies, they're looking to regain that each and every day. And I think while the Caliphate Day desire has been contained, and a lot of it in the Middle East, the ideology is still unconstrained and looks to run rampant through the internet. So that's a challenge. And then lastly, I'll just add, just in the interest of time on the ops side, the world votes. And all of a sudden, in an unpredictable way, here comes another crisis. And on top of mind certainly is what's gone on with Israel and Hamas. And since 7 October, the world's been extremely busy, not only there, but across the world to address this. And Special Operations Command has as well. But in places like Sudan, even before that, where we had diplomats from the United States and partners and allies that were under duress, and there was a lot of work to do there. And lastly, I'll just talk, since it's a tech panel, we're seeing, I think, as all would certainly attest to, the proliferation of drones. And most may go right to things that fly in the air and small quadcopters, but they're getting bigger, they're getting faster, they fly longer, they're loitering, and they're becoming the many of many's when you add autonomy to it. I think we're also seeing robotics in a way that may be a land-based drone. And in the drone variety, we're seeing them not only in the air, but we're seeing them in the maritime and certainly subsurface and surface space. I think artificial intelligence, I tried to check some of these questions through ChatGPT today already, or Perplexity. They didn't come up with a good answer or any good jokes. But I think that that's both an advantage for us as we look to harness that and make decisions faster and certainly grab not only lakes of data, but maybe metaverses of data and put it to use. But it's also a challenge for us as the adversary. We look to use it as well. And I'll just end with the arrival of smart cities. Everything's wired these days. There's cameras, there's pressure device, there's sensors, and it's all being connected somewhere, and I think is either a challenge for us, used against us, or certainly something we should harness. So just a couple of things.
Just a few things,
Just a
yeah.
few.
Everyone's
Not
going to go
much.
hide under their tables after that.
Please don't.
Yeah, and thank you. I appreciate your teammates in Niger very much. I think they were more happy to see me leave than they were happy to see us get there. So,
Not true.
yeah. Michelle, General Fenton just named a number of different threats. What do policymakers see as the biggest threat right now? And what exactly are they starting to do to address some of the things that General Fenton just brought up?
Sure. I think the challenge for policymakers right now is that the volatility of the environment is such that even though the strategy has identified China and deterring China as a pacing threat, the real world is not cooperating. We've got Russia's continued aggression against Ukraine. We've now had this explosive situation between Hamas and Israel in the Middle East, and the risks of potential escalation to a larger regional conflict, and many other, counterterrorism operations, many other things that pull the attention to the here and now because of the stakes involved for the United States and our partners and allies. But at the same time, we have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. We have to be able to keep our eyes and some of our bandwidth focused on the most consequential threat, in my view, which is preventing a war with a nuclear-armed China, whether it's over Taiwan or something else. And we know that, President Xi is very interested in reintegrating Taiwan into Greater China on his watch. We know he prefers political and economic coercion to achieve that objective, as he did in Hong Kong. But we also know that he's instructed his military to have options ready for him by 2027. And so we need to be able to anticipate a potential test of our ability to deter in that time frame. And that is really driving in the Pentagon, I think, a lot of leadership effort to, first of all, set the theater with our allies. So the work you see happening with AUKUS, the work you see happening in the Quad, our deepening relationship with Japan, Korea, Philippines, and other allies and partners, all very critical. But it's also put a premium on accelerating the adoption of innovative technologies, their integration into the legacy force, and doing that with speed and scale. That is going to be critical to us passing that deterrence test and presenting President Xi, if he ever thinks about using force, with enough dilemmas and enough challenges that he says, not today. And so, I know we'll talk a lot about the technology piece of that when we get to Doug, but I just wanted to put a pin in another key issue that is not getting enough attention, and that is the human capital piece. We have got to transform our workforce. I'm not suggesting that the Pentagon becomes a major technology developer. I am suggesting that we need to enhance digital and AI literacy so that you can have the Pentagon and DoD personnel can be smart evaluators of technology, smart buyers of technology, smart integrators and testers and evaluators of technology, smart users of that technology, and overseers. So we have to increase the tech and AI and digital literacy of the department. Lots of great ideas out there to do that, whether it's making better use of the talent we have by giving tech competent people in the military and in the civil service actual career paths to hone that proficiency and make larger and larger contributions, or bringing in new talent through new pipelines, whether, there are all kinds. We have a problem in this country that college isn't affordable. What if we offered digital ROTC, a digital service academy, digital reserve corps to tap into all that wonderful talent out in our innovation ecosystem? There are some very straightforward, in my view, answers to really help bring the talent we need. This has to be a whole-of-nation effort in this competition. So I'll stop there, but I hope that we'll get to the allies and workforce piece of this is not just the technology piece, which is critical, but you have to build you have to work on all the foundations that are really going to allow us to keep our edge.
You can clap. Hey, we'll take all the claps here, believe me. I work in TV. You can clap after every answer here. Doug, Michelle mentioned the adoption of innovative technologies, and oh, God, I'm sorry, I'm not even using my mic. Michelle, you mentioned the adoption of innovative technologies, and you oversee the department's efforts to speed up that sort of adoption of commercial technology. And I wonder where has innovation been on these threats that we're hearing about here, and where is DIU taking the innovation right now?
Great. Well, so first of all, it's fantastic to be up here and really great to be up here with two great friends and teammates. It's an honor to be together for this. And I actually also think it's very fitting that we are sitting here today on Pearl Harbor Day. Because I think that can help to crystallize the mind of what happens when you aren't prepared the way that you need to be. And frankly, if we end up in the kind of conflict that Michelle was just talking about, if deterrence were to fail, we aren't going to have the time between Pearl Harbor and Midway. And so we have to get this right now. So I think that context is particularly useful. Really, if you maybe step back against the problem sets that we face as a nation, whether it's that pacing challenge from China or the others that we are facing, we simply cannot solve for those unless we fully leverage the capability of technology and the incredible, amazing capability that is resident in our tech sector here in the United States and in our allies and partners. We have to take full advantage of that. And we have to do that, first of all, because of the speed that we can bring that capability to bear, which frankly can often be a lot faster than our more traditional pathways of developing more bespoke capabilities for national security, but also because the quality and capability of that technology, much of that innovation is resident in that tech sector. In 11 of the 14 areas that we track as a department, things like artificial intelligence, autonomy, cyber, space now, biotechnology, those areas are not just going faster, but are always going to go faster, driven by the relentless demands of billions of consumers around the world, and the enterprises that serve them. And I just came from that world, although I've also worn a uniform for 26 years on a part-time basis, including a lot of time with General Fenton. That capability is always going to go faster in order to meet those demands. And so we have to, at the same time that we go hard and deep to take full advantage of our bespoke capabilities and pathways, we have to also take advantage of that. And that's really getting after that is why Secretary Ash Carter stood DIU, then X, up originally back in 2015. And he was truly prescient in seeing that and wanting to get after it. And so if you step back and look at that, and I actually had the privilege of kind of being part of that merry cabal that helped make that happen on a part-time basis. Back then, really, DIU 1.0, as I like to call it, was really just about building a bridge kind of at all between the department and the tech sector, because we didn't have one. And we are now light years, obviously, past that. And frankly, the extent to which we're light years past is evident right here up on stage, because you've got leaders at the pointy end and leaders at the policy end of the spectrum speaking and thinking with incredible depth and understanding of what happens in technology and what's happening in technology and what role it plays. You didn't have a commander of SOCOM saying fiber to cyber in 2015. So we're way past that. 2.0 of DIU was about proving that you could take a real military problem and a commercially derived technology, bring them together, and create real impact through real solutions that can help to solve that problem, and then use authorities that we already had on the books to rapidly prototype those things and get them out to be able to be fielded or scaled within weeks or months, not years and years. And that's now been done tons and tons of times. It's been done at DIU. It's been done through all the other innovation and entities that have built up that across the department. All those teammates that we have, we've now done that lots of times. And that's great, but it's not good enough yet. Because what we have to do is take that capability and apply it for strategic effect. And by strategic effect, I mean we have to apply that capability so that we can deter the major conflicts that Michelle was just talking about, or win if we are forced to fight. And until we have done that, we haven't actually achieved that vision that Secretary Carter was talking about when he stood up DIU X in the first place. And doing that is about focusing first on solving those most critical problems that are necessary for that strategic effect, and then working as a whole department in order to scale that capability in order to deliver those strategic effects and do that fast. Doing that is a very different game. That's why, that's what DIU 3.0 is all about. That's why the Secretary has elevated DIU to be a direct report, and that's also why I messed up my perfectly good life to come and join the team and come do it.
But you got to be part of a merry cabal. I love DIU as the idea of it's a merry cabal of people. So we're talking here about transforming for these future threats. General Fenton, how is Special Operations Command transforming? And Doug mentioned speed. Are you transforming fast enough to meet some of these threats that we're talking about here today?
Yeah. No. Okay.
Michelle, next to you.
And I say that through the lens of SOCOM is probably, I would ask Michelle and Doug, is known as a very impatient command. And we're supposed to be that way. Based on the type of missions we get, the teammates that join our organization, they drive us each and every day to go faster, to think deeper, and certainly to get to a solution and to an effect very quickly. So I think each and every day we don't think we're going fast enough. We always want to go faster, and as we put it against the prism of what's coming in the next 10 years, we've got to go even faster. And I think there's a lot of ways to do that. Excuse me. I'm used to being in Tampa. It's a little chilly up here. So I think there's a number of ways to do it. One of them, certainly Michelle and Doug have talked about, with partners and allies. And I think for a Special Operations Command, that's in our DNA. It's been probably since the time of the Office of Strategic Services in the OSS, who needed partners and allies in World War II to do jobs in the European theater with the French resistance, and certainly in the Pacific campaign in places like the Philippines, in order to provide some type of advantage to the larger forces, the larger Army, and the larger Navy. And in many ways, we'll excuse me, we'll look to leverage many of them moving out in this very arena. They're in a number of instances ahead on some tech innovation. They're certainly ahead on the human capital piece, and we're looking to get best business practices from them. I think what you'll see SOCOM doing to try to speed the flywheel up, as we would call it, is to absolutely partner with DIU. I mean, I think in many ways, the future of where SOCOM goes in the next 5, 10, 15 years with regard to tech, the human capital, and wielding it as an advantage and giving options to the Secretary and to the President that we may not have now is absolutely hung to Doug and the DIU team, as well as to industry, the bigs and the littles that SOCOM is known to partner with. And frankly, we've even gone out into the venture capital and the private equity world to get a sense of what teammates that are really atypical maybe 5 to 10 years ago for SOCOM are seeing. That might be initially single-use technology in the commercial space, but could absolutely turn into dual use that would be applicable in the defense space. So the answer is no, but I think we're doing a lot to try to get after it.
Michelle, you mentioned President Xi telling his military to be ready by 2027 for an invasion of Taiwan, should it be necessary. And I wonder if you believe the U.S. military is transforming fast enough so the U.S. would be potentially ready for a 2027 invasion of Taiwan. And if not, what more does the U.S. need to focus more on?
So I think that, if I were to give an assessment, I think the leadership of the department writ large understands the challenge and feels a great sense of urgency. I think that steps have been taken, like hiring someone like Doug, elevating DIU, empowering the organization. They're saying all the right things. They're spending a lot of time on it. In my experience, one of the big lessons I took away from my time in the Pentagon is that getting the policy right is not enough. If you actually want to change behavior, you have to realign the incentives of individuals whose behavior you're trying to change. And so it means really retraining parts of our acquisition core to work with speed and commercially driven technologies that go through an agile development process, very, very different than how we traditionally acquire large military platforms. It means incentivizing them, meaning they get rewarded, they get promoted, they have a career path, and so forth. And it also means that while Congress has been incredibly generous with more flexible authorities, there are some additional things we need from Congress. We need Congress to actually fund DIU to scale, to accelerate the scaling of promising technologies that meet urgent operational needs, like the replicator initiative, for example. We need Congress to give the department some additional flexibility to move monies within capability portfolios. These technologies are changing every 18 months, and if you program something in 2 or 3 year cycles, you're going to be buying something that's already obsolete by the time you get it. So we've got to have some further help from Congress as well.
Doug, you mentioned your role as on strategic effects at DIU as well. And I wonder if you think right now, Michelle just talked about the need for more funding for DIU. Do you have the tools and the funding to actually be able to transform, to deter future conflicts? And let's just name one, right? Let's talk about China. Do you have what you need to deter against a potential conflict, a conflict in Taiwan, invasion of Taiwan?
So I guess I would say not yet, but we're on our way. And I'll maybe make 3 points around where we are and I think where we've got ahead. The first one, by the way, is speaking of funding. We need there to be a defense appropriations, but we need a budget so we can after that has an enormous effect across the department in a myriad ways, not only about what we're getting up to. So. 3 things. The first one is I do think that we are at a tipping point right now in the department and as a nation in getting after this. And if you compare where we are to where we were in those early days back in, say, 2015, today we have a Secretary of Defense who clearly gets this and a Deputy Secretary who clearly gets it. We have leadership across the department who get it. We have interagency partners from the White House to everywhere that get it. We have a commercial tech sector that gets it, where not that long ago, there weren't that many people in the tech sector who really even thought about the fact that you don't just kind of turn on your tap and have the free and open international system come out so that you can build Silicon Valley. Now people get it. And we have a Congress that by and large gets it. So that gives us a tipping point to make change happen. Now we're doing concrete things right now to start to get after that. Things like the Replicator Initiative, or maybe even more important than that initiative, which is a first step, and we'll continue to iterate. That initiative is about both putting real capability in place to meet the challenge that Michelle was talking about, and also to build the muscle in the department as a whole department, which is why all of us are part of this, in order to do that quickly and do it again and again and again. Actions like that that's the department moving to make that happen. Which brings me to kind of my third point, which is about the concept of risk. And you know, I had the privilege of serving with special operators downrange in Iraq and Afghanistan, leaving my civilian life at the time to go and go do that. And when I came home, one of the biggest learnings for me was that I'd spent my entire career up to that point in the private sector, being a private sector executive, thinking about risk the wrong way. Most of what I'd thought about as being risk isn't. It's uncertainty. Risk is a different thing. Risk is risk to mission and risk to force. It's strategic risk for our nation. And what we have to do now, and why that tipping point and those actions are so important, is we've got to be taking risks now that are maybe financial risk, process risk, maybe even reputational risk. And we have to take that kind of risk now so that we aren't transferring risk to real risk for the soldiers, sailors, airmen, guardians, Marines who will have to fight a war if deterrence fails.
So you have to be willing to fail, essentially, to advance.
Take risk of that kind to avoid real risk.
And, yeah, Courtney, if I might just even pull a little bit more on transformation to Doug's point. I think when folks think about transformation, maybe specific to SOCOM, they're going to think about tech. And I did talk a lot about that. But I think there's risk if we don't, and then we've unpacked it. First and foremost, we talk about transformation. It's really about our people. Humans more important than hardware is a long-time first soft truth and motto for Special Operations Command. And I think the first thing when we think transformation is, you know, when I said no, is the speed, is the education and the acquiring of talent that really understands where we're going in this new world. And a lot of that is just the training, the understanding, and how you wield either AI or robotics or autonomy, and do it responsibly, ethically, and under policy, certainly framework that are now and will come from the department. So for us, the first thing when we think transformation, it's really about our people. And are we educating for the future, taking away uncertainty, and that is one part of the risk we look at. Tech, I think I've really hit that one hard. It'd be our second pillar. Third, though, is even our organizations. You know, in SOCOM, we're on a fairly deep sprint to look inside the organization to figure out, are we aligned correctly? Are we organized correctly in order to meet the challenges of the future, and not holding to any dogma that says we should be, you know, a certain number or a certain size, but really what is the mission we're trying to solve for the nation, for the department, and can we do it a better, faster, stronger way by changing organizations? And then lastly, our tactics and techniques and procedures, how we do what we do, it already looks very different than when I joined the formation 30 years ago. And I think we've got to continue to do that and just use the concept of risk. And we need to look at risk across all those, especially for SOCOM.
General Fenton mentioned people, and Michelle, earlier you mentioned allies and partners, and I wonder how you see allies and partners playing a role in this transformation, this need for, which seems to be, Doug was talking about this tipping point in innovation, but it does seem to be that there is this point right now where there is an urgent need to transform for what are some very real threats currently and on the horizon, and I wonder how you see allies and partners playing into that.
So they're absolutely critical. The fact that we have allies and partners in great numbers is a huge source of strategic advantage for the United States. And one piece of good news is the Chinese under President Xi have really overplayed their hands, using coercive measures, intimidation, sort of constant military pressure in places like the East China Sea, the South China Sea, the Strait of Taiwan. And so it's created a bit of a backlash. We have an historic moment in our alliance with Japan in terms of the level and depth and intensity of cooperation. We have the AUKUS agreement, which will give our critical ally Australia not only conventionally armed nuclear-powered submarines, which are tremendously helpful in the region, but also through the Pillar 2 efforts, doing this innovation and innovation adoption, hand in hand alongside each other and along with our friends, the British. The Philippines have welcomed the United States back in. Korea is asking what more we can do. Through the Quad, we're having much more intensive discussion on co-development of technology with India. So, I mean, it's really quite something. The challenge I'll highlight, though, is as you integrate these new technologies, we are going to have to keep investing in means of maintaining interoperability and really ensuring that we bring our allies with us. And that means a lot of this has to be by design for allies from the start, rather than developing something exquisite and US only that we then have to figure out how to go through all the hoops to actually share it. But I think the more we design for allies and partners alongside us from the start, the better that will be, and leveraging commercial technology will help in that regard.
And we only have about 2 minutes left, but Doug, I want to ask you, because one place where the U.S. is really focused on with allies and partners is the war in Ukraine. And if there's can you share any lessons learned from Ukraine these last 2 years that DIU is implementing now?
Okay, well, we could talk about that all day. And by the way, I think speaking of allies and partners, some of our allies and partners from Ukraine are sitting right out here today. So I want to say thank you for being here. We had some great meetings yesterday. There are an enormous number of lessons here. And I'll maybe mention three big yeses and a not yet. So big yes number one is it is absolutely apparent all the ways in which commercially derived technology of all kinds is delivering incredible impact alongside more traditional things like 155 rounds that you also need, and employed by the incredible heroism of the Ukrainians in order to meet their challenge. But things like whether it's space-based technologies or the ability to crowdsource targeting data from not just soldiers in the field, but civilians, bring that together in a way that you can actually get it to where it needs to go in order to make targeting decisions, to all kinds of secure communications across different kinds of networks that can move seamlessly and operate even where the cellular network either is destroyed or is owned by the adversary, or obviously all the ways in which unmanned systems are playing a role, large, small, and what we're learning about first-person view technology, what we're learning about the electronic warfare environment. All of that is incredible lessons, and we're learning a ton, and we are employing all of that for both what we are doing to help support the Ukrainians to deter Russia over the long term, but also for what we need to do in order to deter the pacing challenge over in China. So that's one really big lesson. I'd also just throw out two other yeses. One is there are a lot of ways where sometimes it's easier for us to take capability that is resident in a commercial tech capability that isn't already a big program in the department and share that with a partner. because there's a lot of complexity sometimes about taking our more exquisite things and sharing them, but saying, hey, there's something great over here, you might want to talk to these folks. We can do that, and that's something DIU's been helping with a lot, as well as our partners across the innovation community. The third one is the importance of talent. So sometimes it's not the stuff, it's actually our people forward as far as we are allowed to take them to help in all the ways we can to solve the problems on a real-time basis. And I'll end with just the big not yet, because I think it's a not yet, not just for Ukraine, but for all of us in the leveraged commercial tech, which is that we are not there at the scale that we need to be yet for employing this tech. We need to get to that scale. With everything that we're doing, the scale is not yet there in the ways that we need it strategically, because we need that scale in order to not only help to serve the needs of the Ukrainians, but to deter Russia, as I said, and to meet the much bigger, broader challenges that we have as a nation. And our partners in the tech sector also need that scale, because that's the only way that the ROI works. And right now, some of these companies that we tout and say, these are great examples, some of them have actually had to lay people off during the same time that they're doing all these great things. And that's because the scale's not there yet. So we've got to get to scale.
Thank you all so much. We're out of time, but we could talk all day today. But I think Anya and Neve would never invite me back. So thank you all.
Thanks, Courtney.
Courtney, we appreciate a moderator who keeps us on time. Thank you all very much. Thanks. Great. Thank you.
Sorry about that. Yeah, thanks a ton.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah.
Thank you. That was great. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated because we're going to continue right on with our program. And we're enormously lucky to have with us right now General Cotton, who is the commander of U.S. Strategic Command, responsible for all the nation's nuclear forces and missile capabilities, and Senator Jim Risch, who's currently serving as Senator from Idaho and the ranking member of the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And to interview him, we have none other than our close friend and New York Times correspondent, David Sanger. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Anya, Senator Risch, General Cotton, thank you so much for joining us. You can tell that this is Aspen in Washington and not Aspen in Aspen because we're all wearing neckties, okay? Which is the downside of Aspen in Washington. So we're going to talk a good deal about the great power competition with China and Russia, but I wanted to start the conversation today, General Cotton, with you on a topic you and I have been talking about on and off, which has been the differences between this era and the Cold War that we knew. And you know, you've often made the point, this is not Cold War 2.0. It's quite different and quite more complex. And so just wanted you to play out that argument a bit. We'll ask Senator Risch to comment on that as well.
Well, thank you, Dave. I think, you know, fundamentally, if you really think about it, since the advent of the nuclear weapon, we've never had two near-peer competitors. And for the first time, we have two near-peer competitors that we have to deal with. When we talk about Cold War, the concern, and the only reason I say I don't like using the terminology Cold War, because what I don't want folks to do is to immediately and automatically revert back to how we solved for that problem when we had one near peer, as opposed to now having two. The biggest difference, if you know, just history will play itself out, is when you look at the Cold War era, you had the Warsaw Pact and you had the Western nations. We never relied or counted on Warsaw Pact from the West for any economic anything. Now there's an interweaving with global economics, with potential adversaries, PRC in particular, not only with the United States, but within our allies and partners as well. So I think when you think about the strategy on how do you solve that dilemma, it's a lot different than just pulling out the books of how we solved that dilemma when we had one near peer.
So let me just go one more beat on that with you, General Cotton, which is in the years leading up to World War I, there was a very similar theory that economic interdependence would prevent war from happening. Germany was deeply economically tied to Britain and elsewhere. And obviously it didn't work. We thought consistently that China's economic ties would restrain the way Xi Jinping thought about the world. And he has gone off in directions that I think it's fair to say no one in Washington really predicted. So can we over-depend on the economic interdependence as a restraint here?
As a warfighter, I would say absolutely not. My job is always to be able to kind of create strategies which introduces dilemmas for an adversary, and be able to present those options to the commander-in-chief if required. So that's my job, and that's what I'm going to do, and not count on the fact that that will solve that problem.
So Senator Rich, you've heard General Cotton say that the biggest difference is the economic interdependence. What else strikes you beyond that?
Well, I think what's been referred to here is the complexity of it. A couple things. Number one is the complexity. If the Cold War was a checkers game, we're dealing with a Rubik's Cube today. I think that's the magnitude of the difference. In addition to that, in the Cold War, we had a competitor that we were dealing with. Today, we've got two near-term competitors. But in addition to that, everybody else in the world, the gap in the Cold War was very significant. The gap today isn't nearly that significant. All countries, not all countries, but many countries are moving up to where the gap between the top and the rest of the world is much narrower than what it was. I think all of those things make it a complex picture that makes the Cold War look like a Sunday school picnic in a lot of ways.
Senator Cotton, General Cotton, you could be a senator one day. But we're going to let you retire first before we get to that.
Don't demote him.
Yeah, right. General Cotton, back in 2015, you were a two-star. You were running the Air Force component of the nuclear force at that time. And in those days, and that was, only 8 years ago, China looked like a pretty distant nuclear threat to the U.S. Now, the public, declassified numbers that you see in the annual China report from the Defense Department is roughly 500 deployed weapons now, which is up by about 200, 250 from a few years ago, 1,000 by 2030, and 1,500 by 2035. That's way ahead of, I think, what you were looking at 8 years ago. So tell us first, what did we miss? And then second, how does this affect your day-to-day just planning about the future?
Yeah, I'll probably start, Dave, with the second question first. I think in 2015, when I was commander of 20th Air Force, and that was the ICBM leg of our United States, I actually was pretty happy and satisfied. What do I mean by that? We were well on our way on being able to modernize and have conversations and finalize a modernization of the nuclear triad. That modernization effort was based off of what we saw in the 2010 timeframe as what the geopolitical environment looked like. But I was excited as someone who works on the Minuteman III weapon system throughout my career. But then, short 3 years later, we start hearing the conversations in regards of a nuclear breakout. To your point, the reason I felt excited is because we're modernizing our force. We saw the PRC as a nascent challenge in the earlier years. We articulated that it was a minimal deterrent force. That's how they kind of articulated themselves. But then to your point, you start seeing, the quick rise in their ability to kind of build out their force. Bona fide triad with H-6s as well as submarine force and ICBM force, mobile and ground-based now. That sounds a little bit different than a minimal deterrence force.
And why do you think they made that decision?
I wish I knew, right? I mean, if I wouldn't be a senator, I'd be in Vegas.
Oh, okay.
Gambling.
Or Wall Street.
Right, so sorry, I'm not going to be a senator, but if I knew, I mean, I would, I just don't know why. But the fact is, we now know that it is what's happening. So we're working towards that. And I know we'll talk a little bit later about, what does that mean for us as far as, my operational force and what we do for strategy.
Well, tell us a little bit about that, because obviously it's a very different calculus than what you were dealing with before.
So I think as Commander of Stratcom, what it allows for me, I actually can look back to the NPR, the 2022 NPR. There's a hook in the NPR, and the hook in the NPR is allows us to look to see if the strategy and the numbers work with what we want to be able to present to the President of the United States as far as what objectives the President of the United States wants to meet. So we're actually doing that now within Stratcom to ensure that we can always hold the advantage in regards of having two peers as opposed to.
And that means that you're evaluating whether the current numbers in the triad and the current strategy of how you would employ them would work 10 years from now.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. With the program of records of the modernized systems that we currently have.
Right.
That are on for acquisition programs that we have coming on board.
And while that is still in place, is it your early instinct that we need a significant change in numbers, or we just need a significant change in how we think about how events would play out?
Yeah, so one of the things that I brought to Stratcom I'll be there 1 year tomorrow, is I want us to kind of look differently. We understand what the stockpile is, Right. So what I really want to play out is then how do I meet the objectives? How do I present the effects? Because as a combatant commander, no different than Brian Fenton, my good friend who was here in the earlier session. As a combatant commander, my job is to be able to present effects that will meet the objectives of the president. As Stratcom commander, people need to understand this. I am the strategic deterrence combatant commander. It's more than the nuclear deterrence combatant commander. My job is to be able to produce strategic effects, whether it's kinetic, non-kinetic, whether it's conventional or nuclear. So what I have the team doing is figuring out how do we take all of those things to still be able to meet the objectives, knowing that we have two.
Based on the stockpile that you currently have?
Absolutely.
Okay. So, Senator Rich, unless you want me to promote you to general, let me ask you about the stockpile, because I guess the question that I get asked the most and the discussion I have the most with your colleagues in the Senate is, if you think about a China that is building up to rough parity with the United States by 2035, to a Russia that may be unconstrained by New START in less than 2 years, do we need to begin now to be building up the nuclear force 10 years after Barack Obama said publicly we want to be making nuclear weapons a less central part of our deterrent strategy?
Well, the obvious answer to that question, I think, is that 10 years ago was so much then and not now. I don't know what his position would be today. I can't imagine it wouldn't be different today than what it was then. Things have changed dramatically. But look, I think the first and foremost, what we have to do is, and by the way, you made reference to Russia having some constraints under New START. I would respectfully disagree with that. I led the charge against New START. I didn't think it would constrain them in any way, shape, or form, and I still don't.
Well, it has constrained them on numbers. They've obeyed by the numbers. Well, they've gotten rid of everything else.
That's true, but the numbers alone really are not as important as other things that they have done. And I mean, there's been cheating. There's been all kinds of things that have happened. You just can't trust these people. I mean, we made the mistake when Berlin Wall came down, thinking that Russia was going to become a normal player on the planet, and they certainly they started out that way, but it's changed dramatically, particularly in recent years. So you can't trust them. These treaties are not the beginning and end. I think that your reference to how we look forward and plan, now that the world is a different place than it was, even at the time New START was argued, we're no longer looking at a single stockpile of nuclear weapons in a peer country. We're looking at two of those. And the second one is growing rapidly, as the general referred to, and that has got to be taken into consideration and recognized. And it is, by the way. I think that those of us in the first branch of government are well aware of this. The general keeps us aware of this. Others do. And this, by the way, is not a partisan issue. This is a nonpartisan issue. It's an American issue, and we have differences, as we always do, in some minor respects. But look, the nuclear deterrence of the United States is a paramount question for the national security of this country. And I can assure the American people that we are serious about it. We are dedicated to it. If you hear people, particularly political people, sniping at it, don't take that as some kind of an indication that we're weak. We are not. We are strong. We are dedicated. We support the general's efforts, and we're pulling the wagon together on this issue.
So, Senator, we have seen Russia and China declare a nascent partnership. Putin and Xi Jinping did that just before the Olympics, just before the invasion of Ukraine. So far, we haven't seen any evidence, at least in the public realm, of any nuclear planning together and so forth. But obviously, the concern is that they could coordinate the use of their nuclear arsenals in an effort to intimidate, change General Cotton's strategies along the way. Is it your sense that the Senate, the administration, is beginning to think about coordinated nuclear employment, even in the terms of threats, between Russia and China?
Well, I think, first of all, you have to assume the worst when you're making these kind of plans. But having said that, Russia and China are not natural allies by any stretch of the imagination. They do share some things in common. They have autocratic governments, very different than our democracies. They have socialism and communism, very different than our democracy and freedoms we have here. So they have those things in common. But there is no great warmth and trustworthiness between these two. The world is in my judgment, I see the world kind of dividing into the autocracies and the democracies on two different sides. And I think that's going to be one of the real challenges of the rest of this century. I think that divide is going to continue. Best way to watch it is in the votes in the United Nations. I mean, they frequently break along those lines. And so you have these two poles that are becoming more solid. You have what I call the no-goodniks on one side, the Irans, the North Koreas, the Russians, the Chinese, the Cubans, the Venezuelans, the Syrians, and a handful more candidates that fall into that category. The rest of us are democracies or close there too, and it's just a different way of thinking, a different way we conduct our lives, different cultures that we have. And I think one of the great challenges of the 21st century is how we are able to get along and stop thinking about killing each other. We've got to exist on this planet together. China is not going to change. They're not going to suddenly wake up one morning and say we're going to have democracy, we're going to have capitalism. Russia certainly isn't going to do that. Iran certainly isn't going to do that, although with the demographics there, they have a better chance of changing. But we have to figure out how, just as we did at the beginning of the Cold War, we are able to exist on this planet, having our own, pursuing our own lanes.
General Cotton, let me take you back for a moment to something that happened just before you took over at Stratcom. It was October of 2022. We were 5 or 6 months, 7 months into the Ukraine war. And the administration went through what I guess I would say was the biggest nuclear scare I've seen in the 30 years that I've been reporting in Washington. And it was when they had some intelligence, fortunately turned out not to be the case, that the Russians might employ a tactical nuclear weapon inside Ukraine. And of course, that's been a constant concern just based on the public statements that Putin has made. For a little while, there was a big rush, as you recall, to get the Chinese, the Indians, and others to tell Putin there is no role for nuclear weapons here. But there was a concern when this was all over that moment had kind of changed the atmosphere, that suddenly it had legitimized the idea that a nuclear state might threaten nuclear use against a non-nuclear state. And I'm wondering how much of a permanent alteration you have seen in the atmosphere from that moment and from the overall Russian lurking threat of using tactical nuclear weapons?
Yeah, I think first of all, when we talk about non-strategic nuclear weapons and you hear people use that vernacular, what that really means, to the senator's point, is all nuclear weapons that aren't covered under New START, which is about 2,000 of them that the Russians currently have. I was actually the commander of Air Force Global Strike Command, so I was the air component to Stratcom at the time, so I owned a bomber and an ICBM leg during that time. You're right, though. It was, if nothing else, what it did, it drove the conversation even down to, I would say, dining room tables in people's homes on having a conversation on what does strategic deterrence, what is the definition of that? What does that really mean? The portfolio of that, to be frank, over about the past 25 years was something that a lot of folks didn't pay attention to, right? Because it was, even though it has and always will be foundational to national security, especially in the nuclear deterrence piece of that, it was just something that we never discussed and had a conversation about. Now we have forums like this where we can actually have the conversations and discuss strategic deterrence.
Yeah, David, let me speak to that for just a minute. I think this is a really important point. First of all, America needs to understand how we've gotten to where we are in Ukraine. When the Soviet Union broke up, 4 of the countries that came out of the Soviet Union were nuclear armed: Russia, Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Ukraine. Ukraine at that moment was the 3rd largest nuclear power on the planet when the Russian
but not in control of the weapons
well, they had the possession of those weapons. We've seen what Ukrainians can do when they have the ability. But look, we, the United States, had a policy then. We have the policy now, always have had the policy, probably always will, that the less countries that have nuclear weapons, the better off that the whole world is, and particularly us, for our national security. We sat down in 1994 with the Ukrainians and persuaded them to give up their nuclear weapons, which they did. They surrendered and gave up their nuclear weapons. And we said, if something happens, we'll be there for you. Well, here we are. And then, fast forward to the time you just mentioned, and that is the Russians start threatening using nuclear weapons, and all of a sudden the world says, well, wait a second. You know, Ukraine had nuclear weapons. They can't respond. Russia's threatening them with nuclear weapons. Where are we? And I have said all along since this thing started in Ukraine, if indeed the United States does not stand behind Ukraine, I really believe you're going to see. I worry about what our enemies would think, but I worry much more about what our allies would think, and that is, they say we can't count on the United States. We got to have nuclear weapons. And I really think that a default in Ukraine would set off the largest nuclear race on the planet that we've ever seen.
Have you said that to your colleagues who are, do not want to extend the aid?
Well, I think that that's a separate issue, but it is more talked about by you guys in the media than it is up on the Hill. Those numbers are much. The people who do not want to do this get a whole lot of ink, whereas the 92 of us in the Senate that think that we need to do this don't get nearly that kind of coverage. So, but back to that question, yes, we have had those conversations privately, and believe me, it is a serious conversation. It is something that people always say to me, what keeps you awake at night? There aren't a lot of things that do, but I'll tell you, setting up, if, you know, Japan's under our nuclear umbrella, South Korea's under our nuclear umbrella, the Philippines are, certainly all NATO countries are, if all of a sudden they say we can't count on the United States, that really changes the view on this planet regarding nuclear weapons. It is a serious, serious concern, and I don't know whether the general agrees with that.
Well, David, if I can add to the senator's point, you know, we talked about the transactional partnership between Russia and China. We don't have transactional relationships. We have alliances and
That's right.
and partners. You know, I think one of the things that we did in Stratcom this year to prove extended deterrence and assurance to allies and partners was two efforts that happened, and that was the SSBN that visited Busan in South Korea to show assurance to the Republic of Korea, as well as flying a B-52 to Seoul for the first time in a long time. What made that even more amazing from my perspective as a Stratcom commander was being able to see the deterrence factors that came out of that, especially that B-52 flight, because on each wing was some fighters from the ROK, and on the other wing was the fighters from the JASDIC from Japan. And I think that makes a difference in regards to the adversaries that were watching that, whether it's DPRK or whether it's PRC, on, you know, that confidence building of assurance with those two nations and us. So you know, I'm quite proud of the fact of the work that my air component and my naval component did to put all that together to make that a reality.
Well, General Senator, I have so much more I wanted to ask you about, including the defense industrial base and so forth, but one of the rules at Aspen, their deterrent effect is to make sure that we stay on schedule, and there's massive retaliation that is promised if we don't. So I'm afraid we have to end it here, but I want to thank you both for what's been a really enlightening conversation. Thank you. Thank you.
As always. Thank you.
There are trap doors for those who don't stay on time. That's not actually true, but we might institute that. Thank you. Thank you so much, General. Thank you, David. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now my great pleasure to introduce David Cameron, he needs absolutely no introduction. He is the brand new Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom, but also, of course, former Prime Minister, a man who is a staunch ally of the United States and the West, who has seen a lot of the world, has seen how the West must stand together on Ukraine and on other issues, and has also wrestled with similar domestic issues than we are dealing with now on immigration, on populism, on all sorts of different issues. So without further ado, let me ask to the stage David Cameron. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, it's great to be with you this morning. About a month ago, before I took this job, if someone said to me, come to Aspen, it probably meant come for a skiing holiday. Now it means come and speak at a conference. But I couldn't be more delighted to be in this job at this time, because there are so many difficult issues that we have to get to grips with. And it made me think the other day about the first job I ever had in politics, which was in 1988, 1989. I went to work for Margaret Thatcher. And I'd just left university, and I looked back to that time. At that time, the Berlin Wall was falling, the Soviet Union was breaking up, Russia was becoming a friend, China was joining the WTO and the World Trade Organization, democracy was spreading across Europe and in many ways across the world. More and more countries were adopting market-based economics. It wasn't the end of history, but it felt like a time where we were making extraordinary progress. And you contrast that with today, and it really couldn't be more different. A war in Europe, a conventional war in Europe, this crisis in the Middle East, a much more aggressive China, an unbelievably aggressive Russia. Instead of free trade spreading, more and more countries adopting protectionism. And I think the first thing to realize in this different world is just how much has changed and how unlikely it is to snap back. Sort of liberally minded conservatives like me have a bit of an optimism bias. We always think things are going to go back to how they were. In fact, I remember a conversation I had with Barack Obama at a G7, and I said, Barack, you know, Britain and America, we are the two fastest growing economies. We should be so proud of that. We're doing such a great job. And he said, yes, David, we are the two best looking horses in the glue factory. And I think at the time I thought, well, you're just a bit gloomy, Barack. But now I realize, in fact, what he was saying is really the world had changed. Things were much more difficult, and we had to recognize that. And I think it is really important to do that, because at this time, it's never been more important to strengthen our defenses, to harden and protect our systems, to build on our key alliances, to work with our closest friends and allies. And that's why I'm here in the United States today. And I think we should also be frank about something, which is our domestic politics is actually making it harder not only to do that, but also to engage in the world in the way that we need to try and build our security and stability that we need. And I mean, I heard this on the Hill yesterday over and over again, but I hear it also back at home, which is, you know, why should we meet these challenges overseas when there are so many challenges at home? And I think we should be frank that there are some things that have fundamentally upended and changed our politics. The pressures that we have from mass movement of people and illegal migration. The fact that globalization hasn't benefited every part of our country equally. There are people and places left behind. And of course, the incredible amplification to these two problems, if you like, economic dislocation and social dislocation, the incredible amplification that comes through social media. And I'm not one of those people who just says, well, just ignore that and don't think about that, just get on and make the arguments for engagement. We have to deal with those problems. We'll only be strong internationally if we can be strong and prosperous domestically. And that's why I think it doesn't matter whether you're Democrat or Republican, Conservative or Labour, we've all got to meet those domestic challenges in order to engage. But nonetheless, the arguments for engagement are stronger than ever, and we've got to make them, however hard it is. And it's a difficult point to make here, but it is true. You know, we are the same. Our people live all over the world. Our businesses trade all over the world. We benefit massively from investing in that engagement to try and deliver the security and the stability that we need. The biggest beneficiary of Pax Americana was America, and it's worth making that argument over and over again. So how do we do it? Well, let's start with the Middle East, I absolutely stand foursquare with you in the United States in recognizing that the attacks on the 7th of October were an appalling terrorist act, an invasion of another country. I stood in Kibbutz Be'eri and saw what had happened. Children massacred in front of their parents, parents murdered in front of their children, and we're right to support Israel as they try and deal with the Hamas terrorist threat. And people who call for sort of an immediate and permanent ceasefire do need to understand that if you stop now with Hamas still in charge of even a part of Gaza, there can never be a two-state solution. So I think it's important we support Israel while at the same time arguing about the importance of international humanitarian law, the importance of reducing civilian casualties. And we will make those points over and over again. But I want to make this point. As we look ahead and think about the future and how we try and build a future for Israel and for Palestinian people to live in dignity and justice, the D bit of FCDO, the development part, is going to be every bit as important. And it's the same in America. We're going to have to try and work out how to build up the Palestinian Authority and revitalize it. We're going to have to work out how to engage the Arab states, how to try and rebuild what the Palestinians have and what they need. And to people who say, well, this development bit, it's a rather soft bit of your foreign policy or your security policy, and really the issue is China, I would just make this point, that we need, Britain and America and the countries that believe in democracy and freedom, we need to offer other countries an alternative to China. As Larry Summers once said, it's no good if you go to an African country and they say, yes, it's great, China builds us a bridge, you just give us a lecture. That's no good. We've got to offer that alternative. And I think it's a really important thing we can work together to make sure we're able to put investments into those countries rather than leave them to the mercy of Chinese debt traps. But crucially, what I want to talk about today and why I'm here is Ukraine. I have a very simple and straightforward view about this. Putin's invasion of Ukraine was the worst example of one state invading and wrecking the sovereignty of another state that we have seen since the Second World War. And it is a huge challenge to us. I'm not worried about the strength and unity and consensus and bravery of the Ukrainian people. I've been there, I've seen it for myself. I'm worried that we're not going to do what we need to do. Add up the economies of the countries that are on the side of Ukraine. We outmatch Russia by 30 to 1 in terms of the size of our economies, the size of our GDPs. We've just got to make that size count. And we've got to make sure we give them the weapons, the economic support, the moral support, the diplomatic support, but crucially that military support that can make a difference. And I want to just take the few moments I've got in my 10 minutes, I think I've still got a couple left, which is to try and take on some of the arguments that you hear against this engagement. The first thing you hear is, it's failing, it's not working. I think that is nonsense. If you look at what the Ukrainians have done, they have taken back half of the territory that Russia stole. Yes, it's something of a deadlock on land at the moment, but I was standing in the Odessa port just a couple of weeks ago, where the Ukrainians have pushed the Russian Navy back right across the Black Sea. In the process, they've sunk about a fifth of the Russian Black Sea fleet. They've opened up a maritime way so they can export their goods and their grain, and over 200 ships have used that maritime lane since that amazing work was done. So they are exporting again, they're growing again, their economy is succeeding again, and we should be backing them on that basis. Now, the second thing you hear is Europe pulling its weight? Isn't this all the US, and are we doing enough? Well, you are doing an incredible job, the weapons you supply, the economic support you give, but the figures now show that actually European countries are doing, if you add up the economic support and the military support, are doing twice as much as the United States. So the support really is there. And if you vote through this package, however you do it and whatever you have to connect it with in Congress, it will give an enormous fillip to those European countries. But the other thing I'd say is, yes, in the past, sometimes Europe has been rather disunited. But I was at the NATO conference in Brussels a couple of weeks ago, and I've never seen NATO so united, so engaged, and with Finland and Sweden joining, actually growing and succeeding. That is already a massive failure for Putin that he's managed to bring about that unity. Now, the next thing you hear is, well, is the strategy clear enough? Do we know what we're trying to do? Yes, we're trying to help the Ukrainians through what is going to be a difficult winter, and we want to supply them so they can rebuild next year and sustain what they're doing. Why is that so important? Anything less than that is a victory for Putin. And if there is a victory for Putin, it won't be the end of this. I stood in Tbilisi in Georgia in 2008 when he took a part of that country and warned this would happen. And now it's happened in Ukraine. And if we let him win in Ukraine, it will be somewhere else next. And it won't just be American money that's at risk. It might be a NATO country, so it could be American lives. The value for money of what you have put in is astounding. What is it, like maybe 10% of your defense budget used by the Ukrainians has destroyed half of Russia's pre-war military assets. Now, if that isn't a good investment, I don't know what is. I think the final point that people raise is, what about Ukraine? Is it corrupt? Should we be helping this country? Of course, Ukraine isn't perfect, but it is a democracy. It's a democracy that voted in a referendum, every part of that country, Crimea included, Donbass included, to be an independent sovereign country. It is a democracy. It has a remarkable president in President Zelensky, and it's passing laws that are tougher on corruption than anything that exists in your country or in my country. So I see it as the great test for our generation, the great challenge for our generation. Are we going to defend this democracy? And are we going to recognize that European security is also American security? And we should stay united on this. We should pass this money to the Ukrainians. We should back them and make sure that it's Putin that loses. Because if that money doesn't get voted through, there are only two people that will be smiling. One of them is Vladimir Putin in Russia. The other one is Xi Jinping in Beijing. And I don't know about you, but I don't want to give either of those people a Christmas present. Thank you very much. Jennifer.
Well, thank you very much for outlining your views on Ukraine, why it matters. It's so great to have you here in Washington. You're the first former prime minister, I think, since 1970 who's been given a ministerial job. So that is significant. Your first trip was to Ukraine, as you mentioned, and you touched on some of the points. But tell us more about why you think Ukraine can win. How can Ukraine win? Because, as we've all seen, it is pretty stalemated right now.
Well, I think you've got to look at what they've done so far. I think Russia's suffered over 300,000 casualties. NATO's got bigger. They haven't been able to sustain the land that they took from Ukraine. And I think you can see, with examples like the Black Sea, just how Ukraine can push back. And I think, I mean, just to give you one example right now, if we are able to give Ukraine more of the long-range missiles that the UK has been giving, and the US has too, bringing Crimea under proper threat, I mean, there is nothing that will drive Russia further back and put Putin more on the back foot than actually seeing that Crimea, which is legally part of Ukraine, is properly under attack from Ukrainian forces. So, look, sometimes you have to be patient. And I think that's one of the problems we have in democracies, is we can be impatient. And these things do take time. But I'm absolutely convinced this is worth investing in. And the Ukrainians, there is no doubt that they are absolutely committed to recovering their territory. And I think that we should be helping them with that.
Do you think for NATO and the U.S. in particular that Crimea is a red line, and that's why the U.S. has not provided the long-range missiles that the UK has provided? It certainly shouldn't be a red line, because Crimea is part of, I mean, you know, there was I'm a bit of an expert on referendums, but there was a referendum in 1991. You said it, not me. I know, I thought I'd get it in there just quickly. In 1991, there was a referendum, and every part of Ukraine, Donbass included, Crimea included, voted to be part of Ukraine as an independent sovereign state. And I think sometimes people can be in danger of sort of falling for Russian propaganda. I mean, I remember in 2014 when, you know, Putin seized Crimea and the Donbass and tried to sort of spread this message of confusion that it was all about what had happened in the Maidan and the things that were happening in Kiev. It wasn't. It was a straightforward steal of territory.
And I think it's been refreshing that this time round there's been absolute European unity over it. And so it shouldn't be seen as a red line militarily at all. It is part of Ukraine. Now, what happens at the end of this process, that's not for us to say. We have to put Ukraine in the very best position that we can and deliver the message to Putin that he is not winning and cannot win. And at that point, then clearly, there'll be different circumstances applying.
So you were on the Hill. You met with the House Speaker, Mike Johnson, other Republicans who have had expressed concerns about how the money's being spent in Ukraine. Do they have a point? They're concerned about corruption?
Yeah.
They don't know where the money's going? What were your answers to them?
I think they've got, there are lots of concerns people express, but my view is there are good answers to all of that. If you take the issue of the money, as I said, it's 10% of the defense budget to have a massive impact on Russia that has now turned into, we didn't pick this fight. They have turned into our adversary by what they did in Georgia, by what they did in Ukraine. And I'd also make this point that, we're working very hard to not only just supply weapons to the Ukrainians, but also to train them. I started this program as Prime Minister, and Britain has now trained 30,000 Ukrainian soldiers. So from everything I can see, the weapons that are going to Ukraine, the military support that's going into Ukraine, is being used very effectively. I mean, that figure of what has happened in the Black Sea, Ukraine doesn't even really have a navy, but they have managed to sink about a fifth of the Russian Black Sea fleet. Well, that is, I'm sure the Pentagon is excited by the value for money on offer there. It's a remarkable thing.
And just yesterday, the helicopter fleet, the Russian helicopter fleet, it was I believe a U.S. missile that took it. Explain what happened there.
Well, I think in one night, something like a fifth of Russia's attack helicopters in the theater were destroyed, and I think that was via one of the U.S. ATACMS long-range artillery. And that, again, proves that these weapons make an incredible difference. There are many aspects to this war that do look quite like the First World War, the deep trenches, the frozen lines, the big defensive elements and all of that. But I think what you've seen is where we have, gone further on weapons and helped, they can make an enormous difference. And I think, Britain, I'm proud of the fact, and I can say this because it wasn't me, it was my predecessors, have been ahead of the game. There are a lot of people concerned, should we give the Ukrainians anti-tank weapons? We did give anti-tank weapons. That wasn't an escalation. It was just, quite rightly, one ally giving another ally the right to defend itself. Same argument about tanks. Same argument about long-range artillery. Same argument about jets. And I think, look, as long as you don't cross the red line of NATO soldiers fighting Russian soldiers, we should be doing everything we can to support a sovereign, independent nation to defend itself. And I think Britain's been in the vanguard of that, and I think we've been justified in the results.
Do you think there's been too much concern here in the United States at the leadership level about the potential for nuclear war, and that led to hesitancy in the beginning 2 years of this conflict?
Well, I think, I understand that, because, the US is the linchpin of NATO and the owner, as it were, of the deterrent in many ways, that you have to think about these things very carefully. But as I say, I think when you just think about it logically, what are we doing here? We're helping an independent sovereign state to defend itself. It has that right. It has the right to use our weapons and be trained on those weapons in order to defend itself. That doesn't limit you to no tanks or no long-range artillery or no long-range missiles. It means all of those things, sometimes with proper safeguards, should be available. So I think sometimes there's been a hesitancy over escalatory threats, which actually experience hasn't borne out.
But do you think the nuclear threat is off the table now?
Well, look, no one with Putin, you can never say anything is completely off the table because, because of the way he behaves. But it's clear that what we're doing is completely acceptable as supporting a sovereign independent nation.
Let's go back to the money issue, because that is what's resonating on Capitol Hill and among some Americans. There's some misunderstandings about how much the U.S. is spending versus Europe. There's some old narratives, I think, that Europe is not pulling its weight, that NATO is not spending 2% of their GDP on their defense budgets.
Well, let's do the 2% first. I think that's important because I wasn't Donald Trump's biggest fan, but on this issue, he was right to say that more European nations needed to spend 2%. Indeed, at the Cardiff NATO conference, which I chaired in 2014, we said it was time for everybody to meet 2%. At that time, I think there were only 4 nations, of which the UK was one, were meeting 2%. NATO's got over 30 members. I think we're now over 20 meeting 2%, and real progress on the others. And I think we're getting to a stage now where the ones not on 2% are really beginning to feel the pressure. And that's right. It's not right that America has to overpay for Europe's defense. We must pay our share. But when you come to the figures of what's happening now in Ukraine, I think I'm right in saying if you add military, civilian, economic, and humanitarian, I think that the overall European figure at 160 billion is almost twice as much as the US figure. So I think we really are pulling our weight. And the impact of this vote in Congress will be huge because it will enable those of us that really want to get behind Ukraine for the next year to be able to go to all the other European countries and say, right, you've seen what the US have done, now we all need to join in.
And the UK is the second largest donor of military assistance in Ukraine after the US. And Lloyd Austin yesterday told the Defense Contact Group that of the $44 billion that the US has spent in military aid, the Allies have spent a total of $36 billion. That often also isn't out there. Let's also talk about the investment in the defense industrial base. So you hear these figures that the US has spent $100 billion in Ukraine. And it sounds like a lot of money to your average American, but a new Washington Post report put together by Mark Thiessen and his colleagues at AEI suggested that actually 90% of that money is staying here in the United States. It's helping build the defense industrial base. Of the $68 billion, 90% is going to building up munitions supply chains in 31 states. They looked at 117 production lines. Why is this a good investment?
Well, I think it's not only that ultimately lots of our constituents and members of the public live in places, whether in the UK or in the States, where there's a big industrial base and there's jobs and there's investment that will go in as a result. I think also, Ukraine has been a tremendous wake-up call to the West. It's totally reinvigorated NATO in the way that I said, and that's a positive development because NATO has safeguarded our defense these last 60 years. But also, I think it's a wake-up call that, just in time might be okay for, Amazon deliveries, but just in time is not okay for defense. We do need to have bigger stocks. We do need to have more solid supplies. We do need to make sure that our supply chains are secure. And I think all of that work that's taking place is very important. And I think we're at a point where we've got to stop thinking about how we're running down our existing stocks to supply Ukraine. We need to think much more about how we build up our stocks. And I think in the more dangerous and insecure world that I was talking about, supply chains, stocks, defense commitments, these things have become more important. And they're also more important for allies. I've just wedged in the point here that AUKUS, which is a great development, AUKUS won't work as well if we, the Brits, or the Australians, can't sell weapons systems to other allies that need to defend themselves because of the restrictions from ITAR and other things. We've got to find ways as friends and allies and partners to make sure we can help fellow democracies to defend themselves.
Why haven't sanctions against Russia and Putin worked?
Well, I think they've worked to an extent in that, the calculation I've seen is that had the sanctions not been there, there would be another $400 billion that would be available to Russia's war machine. I think to start with, we needed to make sure the sanctions were smarter, and the oil restrictions now I think are much better at making sure that the higher oil prices don't feed into Russian revenue. But keeping up the pressure, we just actually did some additional sanctions yesterday on 46 entities in 11 different countries, including Uzbekistan, Turkey, a fellow NATO, China, all countries who've got businesses that are selling dual-use goods to Russia, so we're using our sanctions regime to stop that. Today we sanctioned 2 Russians linked to the FSB who've been trying to disrupt our democracy. So I think this is about having a kind of full spectrum right across the system approach to dealing with Russian bad actions.
Do you think the $411 billion of Russian money overseas that's been frozen should be used to rebuild Ukraine?
Yes, I think this is a really interesting argument, and I'm going to be talking about this with Secretary Blinken later today. All of our countries, quite rightly, have confiscated Russian assets and frozen them, and I think there's a very strong argument for saying, let's, instead of just freezing that money, let's take that money, spend it on rebuilding Ukraine, and that is, if you like, a down payment on the reparations that Russia will one day have to pay for the illegal invasion that they've undertaken. Now, there are lots of arguments that will be produced against this. Arguments about, won't this chill investment in our economies, or isn't this somehow breaching legal undertakings of the past, or all the rest of it. I've looked at all the arguments, and so far I haven't seen anything that convinces me this is a bad idea. And I think it does fall under the bracket of what I said in my remarks, that, you know, the world has changed. The world's changed with Putin's invasion. It's changed with the way Iran is behaving in the Middle East. It's changed with the level of insecurity we feel in our world. It's changed with the fact that China has become so much more hostile. And you know, there's a tendency in our wonderfully vibrant democracies, as I said, of wanting, you know, being the party for a better yesterday. We want it to snap back. But I would say we've got two crises in the world at the moment, Ukraine and the Middle East. I think it's probably more likely we get a third than we lose one of the two we got already.
Let's talk about China. Today's Pearl Harbor Day. What would a Chinese Pearl Harbor look like, in your view?
Well, well, first of all, we should remember the lesson from Pearl Harbor about, you know, what an appalling act of aggression that was, and the importance of strength and deterrence through strength, which is, I think, at the heart of the lessons we learned in the 1930s and the 1940s. I mean, that's why I feel so strongly about all this stuff. You know, you don't have to be a brilliant student of history to know that appeasing Hitler in the 1930s was a disaster, and we ended up with more invasions and more Hitler until eventually we had to do something about it, and eventually the United States had to come in and help us, and the blood price gets higher the longer you wait to intervene. Look, I think with China, what I would say is, in my time as Prime Minister, yes, we tried to build a positive relationship. We tried to engage over issues like trade, and some of those resulted in good economic outcomes for our country. But you know, China has changed. Since I left office, we've seen the treatment of the Uyghurs, we've seen the treatment of Hong Kong, we've seen the wolf warrior diplomacy, we've seen the kind of, you know, terrible situations that were created when Australia said something or Lithuania did something, and you know, it is a different China we're dealing with, and we need to harden our systems and be very clear-eyed as a result. And I think one of the strands of our approach is not only to try and protect ourselves and our systems against, for instance, cybercrime, but also to align better with our allies, including the United States, because it's much easier to stand up to this sort of things if we stick together.
Do you believe that China's real goal is to take Taiwan without firing a shot like they did with Hong Kong?
Look, the China goal that has always been there, and of course the United States has a one China policy just as we have a one China policy, is they believe in unification of China and Taiwan. The policy approach that we both share, though, is this cannot happen in a way that involves force or violence or coercion. And I think that's the right approach. And I think, you know, if you link back to the Ukraine situation, this is important because China is watching what is happening in Europe. Iran is watching what's happening in Europe. And we know from even quite recent history that if you pull back from one of these vitally important exercises in working together and showing resolve, it resonates around the world.
We don't have much time left, but I have to turn to the Middle East. That was your second trip. Do you still believe that a two-state solution is possible between the Israelis and Palestinians?
I do. I mean, I think, you know, when you go to Israel today and talk to people about it, it feels a long way off because, you know, this is a nation in trauma. Israel on the 8th of October is a different country to what it was on the 6th of October. You know, the people in those kibbutzes where I went in the south of Israel, they were the most peace-loving, two states supporting group of people. Many of them, one of the families I met, one of the people who got taken hostage that day was driving Gazan families to Israeli hospitals to get them treatment. And so it is a nation in shock, so it feels a long way off. But ultimately, if you're a friend of Israel, and I am, long-term security for Israel means not only being strong, not only having strong defenses, it means finding a way where your Palestinian neighbors are also living in peace and security and dignity. And ultimately, that must mean a two-state solution. Getting there from where we are now is incredibly hard, but we have to plan. We have to start thinking what happens on day one after this Israeli operation has finished. What do you do to build up and reform and revitalize the Palestinian Authority? How do you get Arab states to commit to working on that and thinking about how to provide stability and governance and security in Gaza? How do we improve the situation in the West Bank? It is incredibly difficult, but it must, to me, the alternatives to a two-state solution are much worse.
Last question. Does Prime Minister Netanyahu still believe in a two-state solution?
Well, you'd have to ask him that question. See, I haven't forgotten all the political answers that you have to give. Look, I think the answer there is it is in Israel's long-term security interests. And so friends of Israel have to persuade them of that fact, and then I think judge them by whether the actions they take make it in the long term more likely or less likely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Foreign Secretary Cameron, for telling us the common sense reasons that the United States, along with Europe and our other allies and friends, should continue to invest in the security of Ukraine. We really appreciate that message. We're very grateful to welcome to the stage one of the good, longtime friends of the Aspen Strategy Group, John Podesta. He's held every difficult job in the United States government and has recently gone back to, I think, what is one of your greatest passions, which is to solve the crisis that is climate change. And it may not be an obvious thing for a national security conference to focus on climate change, but we always do every time we have a conference because it is a national security issue, a critically important one. It is already making civil wars in Sudan and Syria and elsewhere worse. It is causing a migrant crisis that is largely invisible, and it's only going to get more difficult. So we're very excited to have John Podesta with us. He's straight back from COP28, still jet lagged, so double thank you for that. And no one better to interview him than Jim Sciutto from CNN. Thank you very much.
We'll put you on the right for once, right?
That's where I'm comfortable.
Thanks so much. Apologies for dispensing with the tie. I'm importing a little bit of Aspen, Colorado by going a little bit more casual to Washington, given the weather. You know, to Anya's point as we started, I never doubt that climate is a national security issue. And whenever I have conversations with folks who doubt the reality of climate change, I will always direct them to the U.S. Navy's website, where the U.S. Navy speaks quite openly about the many consequences in terms of national security, migration, wars over finite resources, et cetera. To that point, I don't have to tell you that, but it's certainly something that I have to bring up frequently on the air.
Well, I'll tell my son that. He works for the secretary. But so I'm glad you referenced the Navy. But maybe I'll start by telling a story, Jim, because this is triggering for me, which is when I was Bill Clinton's chief of staff in the year 2000, Gail Smith, who I think you know, who went on to run USAID for President Obama, was our senior director for Africa. And we sent her into the briefing room one day to say that climate change and HIV/AIDS, these transnational threats, were security threats. And she literally got laughed out of the briefing room by your colleagues. Fast forward 14 years later, and the Quadrennial Defense Review first identified climate change as a threat multiplier. And I say today that it's no longer, we shouldn't think about it as a threat multiplier. It is the threat. The effect that Anya noted on human security cascades into national security challenges across the board, both because of the internal displacement of people, which exacerbates state fragility, as well as people pouring over the borders, which has, obviously, as we're watching what's going on Capitol Hill and our inability to kind of find a path forward to get the resources that Ukraine needs, the resources that Israel needs, I think it is something that I think we will only get worse and be more exacerbated in the years ahead. So we have to take it seriously on those terms, as well as obviously on the economic and environmental terms that we usually discuss the topic.
Yeah, that connection between the environment, climate change, and mass migration from Africa into Europe and from South America here is a connection I don't think we make often enough as we're discussing those issues on the air, but we should make more often. All right, to the topic at hand, given COP28 is underway, there is some cautious optimism being expressed by the organizers and others that they will come to some sort of concrete agreement on the phasing out or the phasing down of fossil fuels. I wonder, do you share that optimism?
Look, I think it's a healthy debate. I just came from over there. The United States is on record as being in favor of phasing out of unabated fossil fuels. We did that in the G7 a while ago, and Secretary Kerry's been clear about that. But there's still resistance to it, so the negotiations are now kind of in the clinches. I think one of the things that's happened at this COP, though, is the focus on the emissions from the oil and gas sector have probably never been as prominent. We've been talking for a long time about the need to stop building unabated coal-fired power plants and have put pressure on countries like China to begin to not only stop building new plants, but start retiring their old plants. But I think this COP, perhaps because it's hosted by the UAE, has really put a bullseye on the emissions from the oil and gas sector. On the good news side, I think that led to a significant step forward in terms of reducing methane from the production and transportation of oil and gas. The United States took a lead on that with the rules that the EPA just finalized to reduce emissions from the oil and gas sector. But I think in general, the commitments that were made, I think on the second day of COP, were substantial. But that really only gets at the emissions that are coming from production. It doesn't get to what people in that world refer to as scope 3. What happens when the oil is actually used and the emissions that are coming from that?
You mentioned the word which has been quite a buzzword there, which is the word unabated. Explain what that actually means, because, and does it involve an element of fantasy to say, well, as long as we figure out a way to rein all that stuff in once it's in the atmosphere, we'll be okay?
Yeah, well, unabated means that, there are processes by which you can capture the emissions, the CO2.
Are any of those proven?
Well, they're theoretically proven. Whether they're economic is really the question. I think there's a lot of investment going on now. A bit more distant is direct air capture, although the Department of Energy has supported some demonstration projects in that space as well, and people like Oxy, the formerly Occidental Petroleum, are spending a significant amount of capital trying to demonstrate that technology. That's pulling carbon out of the atmosphere and then sequestering it by injecting it into the ground. More typically, what people are referring to is taking the CO2 out of a stream and then injecting it underground for permanent storage. Has it been demonstrated? Yes, but is it a solution? And I think this is where there's quite a bit of contention even in the COP. I think one way to think about this is you can't just keep burning fossil fuels forever and ever and think that you can grab that CO2 and just put it back underground. That is not going to be an overall solution to the problem. We have to move to clean and renewable sources of energy, but there's certain amount of CO2 that we're going to literally have to be able to remove from the atmosphere or from particularly hard to decarbonize processes where sequestration by mid-century, if we're going to get to where the point, people use the term net zero, where we're taking as much carbon out of the atmosphere as we're putting into it, then there needs to be a space for carbon removal.
I just wonder, and there are a lot of parallels, certainly from the way the industry has handled this to the tobacco industry, but I just wonder if it's the equivalent of filtered cigarettes, Well, as long as we put a filter in, everything will be fine, which we know was not true.
Look,
how much of this is a solution as opposed to a distraction or a delay tactic?
Well, look, I think that's a fair question. What I'm saying is that we have to demonstrate the technologies because we're going to need it. It doesn't mean that we can continue on the path we're on, which is to essentially power our economy through the use in the way we do today of fossil fuels, from everything from transportation to power in the power sector, et cetera. We have to move off of that. We have to electrify more. We have to create that electricity through clean sources, renewables, zero carbon sources like nuclear power. But we're not. But there's a little tail at the end, and I think that this, perhaps the fossil fuel industry likes to pretend that we can just keep doing what we're doing and take care of this through sequestration. That is not a solution, and that will not work. And that's why I think, what I'm doing at the White House is trying to implement the Inflation Reduction Act, which was the biggest investment in clean technology in the history, not just of the United States, but the world, to try to replace those resources across every sector: power, transportation, industrial, buildings, and agriculture and forestry with climate smart and cleaner forms of energy.
And I do want to get to the good news because there is some good news. But before I get there, speaking of the industry itself, are oil-producing nations, and by the way, one of them was the host or is the host of COP28 this year, Abu Dhabi, are they credible partners to address climate change when their incentives are mixed at best?
Well, I think that the truth is that we need them to do things differently. The UAE, for example, is a major developer of renewable power, and so that's, in a sense, a good thing. But they can't keep going down the track they're going, which is to continue to deploy and exploit for as far as the eye can see. And I think the same thing basically is true across the globe. We need to see the economy transformed to be powered on clean forms of energy. And I think particularly in the oil and gas sector, where the usage is so dominantly in transportation, electrification, finding other forms of fueling heavy duty transportation, including through green hydrogen, is going to be where we need to get to. In the meantime, the world still is dependent, if you will, on the continued production of oil and gas. But we have to make this transition, and that's why we're pushing towards, the president set a goal of that 50% of new car sales on cars and light-duty trucks will be electric by 2030, and I think we can accomplish that.
Is there an odd dynamic there, given that U.S. production has grown so much and outpacing many of those that we traditionally saw as owning the fossil fuel business? And by the way, you have a leading Republican candidate for president who said that on day one, drill, drill, drill will be part of his mantra. Where does that put the U.S. role in this as it produces more?
Well, I think in the near term, particularly as a result of what Minister Cameron was talking about, the effect of the invasion of Ukraine, the effect initially on the spike in oil prices, that's come down now, shows our security dependency on fossil fuels, which we need to break. And I think that the U.S. production has helped stabilize prices, and that's, for a U.S. consumer perspective, that's at least in the short term, a good thing. But that doesn't mean that that's a solution over the long term. That's why we need to invest, and we're seeing that investment in cleaner technologies. There's been over $220 billion since the president came into office of investment in clean technology. About over $150 billion of that is in electric vehicles and battery manufacturing, reshoring supply chains. That's the future. But in the meantime, I think we have to manage the economy as it is.
I'm not all a doom and gloom guy. I can't be, because my middle son is very focused on this issue, and I will have conversations in the car. He'll say, listen, the planet's done. We're finished. We've already messed it up. And I'll say, well, actually, good things are happening here. I'll quote him statistics about a more rapid uptake in renewable solar energy, wind power, ahead of projections just a couple of years ago. Those are real numbers. They're not partisan numbers. They're real numbers. It's the reason why I have my car plugged in downstairs, because I couldn't go home to my middle child. So talk about what, from your perspective, is outpacing your projections on the positive side of the ledger.
Well, I think you've mentioned some things. I think what we've seen is really a renaissance in manufacturing led by these clean technologies. I mean, I think that last year, 4% of all spending on buildings, durable goods, was in the clean energy sector in the United States. That's really been as a result of people making that transition, moving forward with innovation, with new technologies, with commitment, that's where the future is. The same thing is true in terms of renewable energy. Solar is now the cheapest form of energy generation in the world. That's why it's outpaced, and now is significantly outpacing fossils in terms of electricity production at a global level, and why we're seeing the big uptake in the United States with respect to the percentage of new production coming on board in the United States. But there are things happening, I think, as I said, across the board, more climate-smart agriculture. We're seeing it in the building sector, transition to the overall sales from the pandemic to now has slowed down a little bit in terms of what people are doing in terms of even in their own homes to transition from, for example, from gas-burning furnaces to heat pumps. But as a percentage of new installations, heat pumps are going up. And I think you're just seeing across the board this movement towards clean energy, and I think that's being led by a policy environment where the government has enabled private sector investment. And the private sector is responding with tremendous energy, actually.
One sign of trouble is specifically on offshore wind, though. Yeah. With inflation, it's increased the prices. You've had companies such as Shell pulling out of projects, Martha's Vineyard off of New England.
Well, most famously, Ørsted in New Jersey pulling out of
yes.
2 projects. Yeah.
Economics had been your friend to this point, particularly on wind, but in this case, that's not the case. And I wonder, do you think that's a short-term setback?
I do. And I think even Ørsted is still in the U.S. market. They're still developing 2 projects. They're breaking ground on, kind of as we speak. The federal government has done a much better job, I think, of increasing the pace of permitting in that context. We just permitted the largest wind project in the U.S., Dominion, off the coast of Virginia. That project is on track and I think will be built. And we'll see the first production off Cape Cod soon. So I think it is true that the headwinds for offshore wind have been more severe, I think, because they're dependent on a lot of upfront investment, and the interest rate environment has, as well as it's taken a little bit of effort and time to get the supply chains going in the U.S. They're more developed in Europe. The industry was obviously more developed in Europe. But so there's a kind of premium in the U.S. right now as those supply chains are developed. But I think as inflation abates, as the interest rate environment gets a little bit better, as people are penciling out those projects, and there's still a very strong commitment and future for offshore wind. We're seeing, for example, New York moving forward with some new offerings, and I think those will come in. Now, did it hit a rough patch? Yes, but I think there's both the federal government, the states on both the West Coast and the East Coast are committed to it, and I think the companies are committed to it. So I think we'll work it out.
I spent a lot of time in my job on the U.S. relationship with China, particularly from a national security perspective, and the various flashpoints, including Taiwan. Of course, we were just talking about that a few minutes ago with the foreign minister. And when I'm writing a book about great power competition, you talk a lot about U.S.-China relationships. The one area of cooperation that is both necessary for the sake of the world, of course, is the U.S. and China have to work together on climate change. But it's also an issue that I'll often hear from policymakers to say, well, it's an area of hope because we are actually discussing cooperation on that issue. And I wonder, is that something you share? Is that too optimistic of you? And can you have that cooperation even when you're discussing potential war plans over Taiwan?
Yeah. Well, I have a history with this because I was, during my tenure with President Obama, I negotiated with the Chinese over a joint statement that we issued in November of 2014 that I think really sparked the negotiations that led to the Paris Agreement in 2015. So I spent a lot of time with the person who is now their chief negotiator, as did Secretary Kerry when he was Secretary of State. He's now continued that, and I give credit to Secretary Kerry for sticking with it, for going back and back and back. And I think the result of the Secretary's meeting with Xie Zhenhua in Sunnylands just maybe 6 weeks ago resulted in some movement forward with the Chinese making a commitment to bind all their greenhouse gases into their NDC. That was a very important step for China. They participated in the work that's going on now at COP around methane reductions, which is a particularly potent greenhouse gas. So that's good news. But I think we're in a very different place than we were during my tenure with President Obama. Both the relationship is more on edge, and we're in a period of real competition. As I think back, particularly at the early days, going back probably into the Bush years, there was the more discussion of cooperation, et cetera. Now we're in a technological competition across a broad range of technologies, semiconductors, clean technology. The Chinese control too much from a security perspective of particularly the upstream technologies around critical minerals, batteries, upstream solar supply chains,
Solar
around,
supply, yeah.
around the development of ingots and wafers. What we're trying to do is push towards reshoring, friendshoring some of that, working with our allies to reduce our dependency on China for the production of those really critical technologies for the next couple of decades.
And hard restrictions. I promised, Anya, to go to the audience for one question. So think about it, and let's pick someone so we can get there. I do have one more question for you. There's almost, maybe delusional is too strong a word, but at least kicking the can down the road. There's an aspect of that in any discussion right now, whether we're talking about the U.S. relationship with Russia over Ukraine, U.S. policy towards North Korea, but also environmental policy. That you have an election next year in which you could have a change of leadership here that would radically change the U.S. approach, certainly to this issue. You have a leading Republican candidate who, while president, publicly stated he doesn't buy the science behind climate change, took the U.S., of course, out of the Paris Agreement. What does that mean for this country, the largest economy in the world, its approach to this issue? Do partners buy that any commitment you make today is going to last beyond the next 11 months? What does that do for U.S. credibility?
Well, look, the last time we had a climate denier in the White House, which wasn't that long ago, who tried to reverse all the actions that had taken place by a bipartisan group of presidents before him, I think, and particularly the decision to pull out of Paris sparked the We're Still In movement from state and local governments, from the private sector, from universities, from nonprofits, et cetera. I met with a lot of them now. Now we're all in, is they've rebranded, when I was in Dubai. And you have this tremendous leadership at the state and local level, and at the business level, et cetera, that are still pushing forward. What I say about the Inflation Reduction Act is, it was built to be durable, and I'm maybe just a veteran of the Affordable Care Act, so I like to, I like to believe that history will repeat itself. But it's built to be durable because the 10 years of support for this clean energy transition that's built into the tax code is resulting in all this economic activity that I mentioned around the country, steel going in the ground, jobs being created, more than 210,000 jobs created just since the bill passed. And that's more every month. It's happening all across the country, north to south, east to west. People focus on red places, but it's happening in California and Nevada and Georgia and Michigan and New York and Maine. It's happening all across the country. That's very hard to uproot. So I'm confident that the policy is here to stay because the crisis is here to be dealt with, and it will organize, I think, society for a long time to come.
Okay, hopeful note. Do we have a question from the audience in our remaining seconds? Gentleman here, microphone coming. If you could make it brief, and then I'll ask you to make it, because they like to keep on schedule.
Is this on? China is the largest producer of electric vehicles in the world. Are they doing anything to move away from coal-fired electric generation?
No, they're still building coal-fired power, and one of the things that I think our diplomacy has done, to both the president in his discussions with President Xi and Secretary Kerry and his discussions with Minister Xia, have emphasized that they need to stop building new coal and they got to start retiring the old coal. Their answer is that they can manage through dispatch the massive build out of renewables. That is fair enough that they're building in China, but they have to stop building coal, and they haven't stopped yet. And so if you power electric vehicles using coal-fired power, you haven't accomplished very much. That's the other side to the question that you're asking. But I think that the pressure, I think, is most that they are most subject to is really from the rest of the world, and particularly the most vulnerable countries that we started off with, the people who are really bearing the brunt of extreme weather, the effect on food and water systems, et cetera. I think that, the world needs to push towards having a change of behavior in China. And the United States is an important voice, but it's that rest of the global community that I think is likely to change Chinese policy.
And a similar question for India as well, but we'll save that for another conversation.
Okay.
John Podesta, thanks so much.
Thanks, Jim.
Enjoyed it, and thanks to all of you.
Thank you so much to Jim Sciutto and John Podesta. Ladies and gentlemen, we now have for you a very special treat. We're very proud to welcome Catherine Tai, who is the United States Trade Representative. And boy, what a complicated job at a complicated time for free trade. It seems that both the left and the right in politics in the United States are making it difficult to negotiate trade deals. She is doing her best. She has just been out at APEC doing a great job for the country with many, many meetings. And to interview her, we have David Weston from Bloomberg. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anya, for that introduction, and thank you very much, Madam Ambassador, for doing this.
Thank you
I
so
know
much.
Everybody wants to hear from you.
Well, I'm looking forward to this.
So am I. So in thinking about this and thinking about your job, it struck me you have a multi-layer job. You cover the globe, literally.
Yes.
But you also cover a lot of different aspects. I mean, some of us might think about trade as economics, which it is.
Absolutely.
But it also covers geopolitics, which is what this organization is really devoted to. It covers climate. It covers the role of workers, a lot of different things. So let me ask you one specific question that touches on the globe and a lot of different aspects, and that is data and the WTO. You changed a policy this fall, I think 30 years plus policy, favoring when it comes to data flow across borders as well as location. You changed the policy, said you were saying, why did you do that?
Okay, let me take 2 steps back and just engage with the way you set up the conversation, because I think it's so important to reinforce this. When you say that you're the United States Trade Representative and you're abroad, I think people will say, oh, well, we have a commerce minister, a foreign minister, a trade minister, something like that. When you say you're the U.S. Trade Representative here at home, and I try to do as much domestic travel as I do foreign travel, you often just get blank looks. What is the U.S. Trade Representative? And I think that that's such an important part of the conversation because, to your point, we sit at the intersection of some very, very powerful forces. One of them is that we are absolutely a part of the foreign policy team. You're right. You have to do trade with others, other countries, other economies. So we're part of the foreign policy tool set. But at the same time, trade absolutely is about economics. And the decisions that you make in your international economic policy impacts your domestic economy. So we are equally a part of the domestic economic policy team, and we sit at that intersection. And it's an uncomfortable intersection because these two forces are often pulling you in different directions, if not always opposite directions. To your point, what we do internationally has to be connected to what we are doing, what we are talking about, what our objectives and our challenges are at home. And I'll use that then to segue to your question about the WTO, which is the public narrative is, and this is my opportunity to explain and try not to get too wonky, although this is a wonky crowd, that what we did this fall at the WTO was not to reverse a position, was not to change a position, but to withdraw our attributions, which is a WTO negotiation speak for, withdraw our indicated support for 3 or 4 proposals in the ongoing WTO negotiations on an e-commerce agreement. It's not a full WTO negotiation, so it's not the full 164 membership that's participating. It's a subset of about 90, a significant portion of the WTO. And what we did was to take a look at what our positions are and to assess whether or not they still align with the domestic debate, domestic conversation, the domestic regulatory environment for these issues. And because it's e-commerce, it is really a negotiation over the digital economy, which at this point is so much of the economy. Everything that we do in the economy now touches on technology and data. So as we were looking, we thought, yes, 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 for most of the proposals, we are still where we have been. And a couple of those proposals, ones that deal really specifically with data, data flows, data storage, data localization, we call it, and also on source code. In these three areas, what I saw was that the debate that we are having here at home, the conversation around technology and technological advancement and data and the regulation of the digital economy has shifted significantly since we put those proposals forward in 2019. And as a result, we needed to withdraw our attributions to create the space for us to come up with new positions and a new orientation for engaging with the other 90 countries that are negotiating this.
Just so that I think I can understand that, is that a matter of domestic questions about possible regulation in this area, because there's talk about that certainly in Congress, or is it a question of international dealings, particularly I'll name it China, which has its own positions on some of those things you're talking about, data flow across and the location of data? Or is it a combination of the two?
I think that there are two aspects of it. So let me take the first one in terms of, again, that connection between what we're doing internationally in terms of trade and economic relations and negotiations and what is going on here at home. We've had the internet. I actually remember it was my senior year of college that the summer between junior and senior years, I'm going to date myself, but I'm not shy, that the World Wide Web was really rolled out for the world. And I remember coming back and going through a training where the question was, where do you put your mouse? You pass your mouse over text, and if it's highlighted, that means you can click on it. So that's in my lifetime. That was my senior year of college, right? So a lot has changed in a short amount of time. We here in the United States don't have a very robust, and this is an understatement, we don't have a very robust regulatory system for the technology and economy environment. We're struggling with that every day because in the last almost 30 years, I haven't been out of college for quite 30 years yet, in the last almost 30 years, so much has changed. And the rules that we put in place and the fact that we don't have rules for a lot of this is starting to come home to roost, like the famous chickens, right? We're starting to realize that the implications of a regulatory system that started in the 90s and hasn't evolved very far is creating disconnects with the implications of this technology advancement. So I'll give you one very, very specific example that I think may resonate with a lot of people because it's a large part of the conversation in so many ways. The unveiling of ChatGPT-4 in the spring, I think was a wake-up moment for all of us that, wow, there's a lot of innovation that's going on in our economy. That is a great thing, but holy Jesus, what is happening here? And I would just say that even 5 years ago, I had the opportunity to participate in a conference at Stanford where they did a whole AI presentation for us. And at the time, the prompts that you were giving AI were coming out with hilariously funny outcomes. When you ask AI that was being trained to write a joke, and the joke that came out the back end was almost never funny, or it was funny because it was so unfunny, right? So at the time, I think just 5 years ago, 2019, 2018, we're thinking, wow, this could have a lot of potential. There's so much innovation. There's so much stuff that's brewing. But we don't have to be worried about it yet because it's still very rudimentary. Short period of time, all of a sudden, for all of you who've experimented with ChatGPT-4 and you've started putting prompts in, literally blowing everybody's minds, right? Which is the focus that we have now on AI. What is AI built on? It's built on massive amounts of data. We'll come back to the issue of data. How do you develop AI? You have to have access not just to those massive amounts of data, you have to have access to incredibly powerful computing processes. You marry those two up, and you're going to push that innovation and push that development. Who has access to that kind of data and that kind of computing power? A very small number of extremely powerful and dominant companies that are almost all, if not all, American. And that's why our posture on the rules that apply to data flows, data localization, and source code is so important. At the core of each of these proposals in these negotiations is the question that we have to answer around the balance of authority between the private sector and the companies and the government and our regulatory authorities. Who gets to decide or control how freely the data can flow and when it can be restricted, where it needs to be stored, and when access is required to disclose source code. And I think that those issues are very much consequential, not just for trade and economics, but for our entire society. And the cross-cutting nature of these issues means that if we're going to lead using trade rules at a time when there is no consensus, but massive amounts of debate and questioning, then I, as USTR, am committing massive malpractice and probably committing policy suicide by getting out ahead of all of the other conversations and decisions that we need to make as a country.
You don't want to be too far behind. You also can't be too far ahead. You got to make sure that you get the balance right. You said almost all. One place that has an awful lot of data is China, and they're developing computer ability very fast. Some people propose, including Foreign Affairs, that we should be having arms control negotiations with the US and China right now over generative AI. Does that make sense to you? Is that something being considered by the US government?
So I say that I'm on the foreign policy team, which I am. On the national security issues, I'll just say that, you know, if you think of it as a band, and Secretary Austin, Secretary Blinken are like the lead singer and the lead bassist, right? USTR, I'm kind of a backup singer or maybe a backup dancer. Like, we are absolutely a part of the team, but I'm not driving that, and I don't think I should be driving that national security piece. As USTR, this is very much true today, and I think that past USTRs haven't had to say it because our domestic situation was different and the global geopolitical situation was different, but I spend so much of my time thinking about democracy. Democracy, we are a political democracy, but I, as USTR, spend a lot of my time thinking about how we can democratize economic opportunity here at home in America, and how we can do that with our partners so that they can do the same thing at home. And I think that that's a really important part in terms of USTR and treating data as a national security a controlled substance. I understand why that has relevance, but I think that we also have to understand the criticality of data to just our regular economic vibrancy.
Moving beyond data, you've taken us, I think, to a version of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, something that President Biden went to Asia and really touted, something that, if you're not the lead singer, you're pretty close to the lead singer on. Give us a sense of where that stands right now. I think there were some expectations at APEC that we'd make some real progress. Some people were disappointed it didn't feel like we did. Is that an accurate perception? And if so, why didn't we make the progress?
So is it an accurate, some people did express disappointment, but let me say what we did. The Indo-Pacific Economic Framework is the Biden administration's economic engagement framework and program for our partnership with our friends in the Indo-Pacific. It has 4 pillars. And we're very much applying lessons that we've learned from the past 7 or 8 years. So first, trade is a pillar, but it is not the only pillar. In addition to trade, we also had a pillar on supply chains, one on decarb and infrastructure, climate financing, that kind of thing, and the last one on specifically it's tax and anti-corruption, but I like to think of it as good governance. When you take them all together, we feel that this is a more comprehensive economic engagement than just a trade negotiation, right? It's also designed to be responsive to the challenges that all of us, all 14 countries in the Indo-Pacific framework are grappling with today. And those are economically with respect to our resilience, with respect to our sustainability, and with respect to the inclusivity of the economic outcomes that we are having at home and together. So each one of those pieces. Now, on trade, let me drill down a little bit more there. Within the trade pillar, we've made very, very clear, this is not a traditional free trade agreement. This is not the TPP. There are things that we did in the TPP that we are not doing in the trade pillar. For example, tariff negotiations. We're not doing them, largely because right now, in terms of aggressive tariff liberalization, it is my view that we don't have a program for doing a tariff program right now that will serve the purpose of resilience and more resilient supply chains. So we're not doing that. But everything that we have scoped into Pillar 1, the trade pillar, has had to answer yes to one or more of the following questions. Does this topic and issue area, does this suite of rules promote more resilience, more sustainability, or more inclusivity? And so we have been working very hard. There are about 10 different issue areas within the trade pillar. We've made significant progress to achieving consensus in about 5.5 of them. Regardless of what we were planning to do or celebrate at APEC in November of this year, we had a very full 2024 negotiation agenda. We will continue with that. We are committed to continuing with it, and we have partners who have told us that they are excited and committed to continue negotiating with us through next year.
Madam Ambassador, you said we live in a democracy, and part of democracy is politics, as it should be. Indeed. That's the way we decide things in this country. We happen to have an election year coming up next year. Is it realistic to expect real progress in the Indo-Pacific economic framework in an election year? Because there are real domestic political consequences.
I'd say this, that the lessons that we've learned from the past, let's say, 7 years on trade, mean that we can't ever ignore the domestic political consequences of what we're doing in trade. So in terms of looking at next year, it will be a particularly political year. But the issue of trade is inherently political. To your point, when you are a part of the domestic economic policy team, how what you do impacts ordinary Americans at their kitchen table is always relevant. And so I think from my perspective, next year for us, we will be sensitive to the scale, but not the nature of the year. And I think that for everything that we are doing, we stand 100% behind the responsibility that we have brought to how we've scoped and designed the negotiations.
Let's talk about how you invest your capital, if I can put it that way. You're responsible for trade agreements. And it strikes me there are at least 3 categories of that: new trade agreements, expanding current trade agreements, or enforcing existing trade agreements. How do you allocate your time and resources among those 3?
So, this is how you do it. You spend 100% of your time negotiating, you spend 100% of your time enforcing, you spend 100% of your time expanding.
Okay, I walked into that one.
Yeah, right, okay. But I'll take it as a segue to talking about our enforcement agenda. We do a lot of things, right? We're responsible for trade policy, and you have to think about that very broadly. In terms of trade enforcement, in order for our trade agreements and our trade arrangements to have integrity, we have to hold our partners accountable for the promises that they have made to us and to our stakeholders and to their stakeholders too. So we take the enforcement agenda extremely seriously. It is a very high priority. A couple aspects of this I want to highlight. One is with respect to the USMCA, which is the renewed NAFTA. Now that renegotiation caught a lot of headlines while it was being renegotiated, and it's really a very, very interesting articulation of the basis for a modern, new U.S. trade policy. One of the most important aspects of the USMCA in terms of what it does that the NAFTA didn't do, it has much stronger labor and environmental standards. It has stronger enforcement mechanisms, and it has in particular a labor-specific enforcement mechanism that we call the Rapid Response Mechanism for short. This is a mechanism that allows the United States and Mexico to work together to reach and pierce the veil of state-to-state interaction to focus on specific facilities within Mexico that are not respecting Mexico's laws on labor justice or the USMCA's rules. And we have activated this, this mechanism. I think the current count is 16 times, 14 times at the behest of petitioners, twice on our own initiative. And in every one of those cases that we have seen through to the end, we have won rights, we have won real benefits for workers in Mexico. Why this matters? Democracy and the democratization of economic opportunity. When Mexican workers have the ability, as they should under their own law, to advocate for themselves for better working conditions and higher wages, we are evening the playing field for American workers. And I think it is not an accident that right now about 90% of the cases that we have brought have been in the auto sector. And I'll give you one specific example. Early on in the first year was one of the first 3 cases that we brought was related to a GM facility in Silao, Mexico. As a result of our work on that, in partnership with the Mexican government, the workers at that facility were able to win a new vote for a union. They voted in a truly independent union to represent them. They voted on a collective bargaining agreement that union negotiated for them, that they saw before they voted to approve it, and they won better benefits. They won the first wage increase that they had had in years. It was a 10% wage increase, and in the second year, that went up another 10%. These are real wins, but the most significant part of this, which I want more people to know about, is what we are doing in the USMCA is relevant to everybody who is interested in trade, because we have flipped the narrative, the strong criticism of US trade policy on its head. For the first time ever, we are offering workers a mechanism for their own advocacy and empowerment through a trade agreement. Without this trade agreement, they wouldn't have this mechanism. And I think that this is one of the cornerstones of what we call the worker-centered trade policy, which is to drive a trade policy that more Americans feel like is going to champion their interests. On the other hand, we're also doing a lot for our farmers, as we always have. And within the USMCA context, without leaving that agreement, I'll say that we've taken very seriously our corn producers' concerns around the Mexican decree that will impact our trading relationship, and we initiated a dispute settlement case in the middle of this year, and we are litigating it out right now.
On the subject of expanding existing agreements, we had, I believe it's your counterpart in Taiwan this week, say we'd like to have a free trade agreement. Let's expand out what we have right now. Obviously that would raise geopolitical issues, foreign policy issues. Are you open to that?
So the negotiation we're having with Taiwan right now, and I'll just highlight here, every trade negotiation we're doing right now has an element of innovation that's baked into it. And this is because we're trying to be responsive to the data and the feedback that we are receiving from the world economy. There are so many changes that are going on simultaneously that I've not met even our smartest economists, even my colleague Janet Yellen, who is a legend in macroeconomics. No one can explain exactly what's happening or predict exactly what's going to happen next. And so from a trade policy perspective, what we have been very disciplined in trying to do is to say, let us bring a trade program to each one of our partners that's tailored to that partner, that's tailored to their interest and our interest in the partnership, that's also tailored to the challenges and the dynamics that we are navigating together in the global economy. With Taiwan, what that's meant is that we have been negotiating agreements, and the first agreement that we have with Taiwan is one that covers, I think, 5 issue areas. It's trade facilitation, it's small, medium enterprises, good regulatory practices, and I'll have to look at my notes for the other 2, but we've got a core group of 5 disciplines. We signed that agreement. Congress, in a fit of enthusiasm, even though they weren't legally required to, took a vote on it to show their support for what we are doing here. And on the basis of that support, we are negotiating another set of disciplines right as we speak. We've been making excellent progress, and we will continue to look at building out those agreements to have an arrangement with the Taiwan economy that is fit for the times. And the times are very challenging. And so this is one of our accomplishments that we are particularly proud of and committed to.
So you don't rule out a free trade agreement, but it's not now.
Look, so let me back up to what do you mean by a free trade agreement, right? Do you mean the traditional kind of U.S. approach to a very, very comprehensive, maximally liberalizing, aggressively liberalizing agreement? We're not doing that with anybody right now. It's actually insensitive to the dynamics in the global economy and the U.S. economy right now to push on with that program, which may have been fit for the 80s and the 90s. Maybe it was starting to show its age in the 2000s and 2010s. It's 2023. We need new policies. There's innovation going on all around us. When we were negotiating those agreements, I don't know, AI wasn't even a thing that we talked about, right? So in all these different ways, but certainly we hadn't experienced the pandemic, supply chain discombobulations and disconnect, the fragilities, the geopolitical tensions where we've always had them, but they were different and at a different scale with different partners. So in all ways, as much as we embrace innovation instinctively as Americans, and certainly in our economy, we need to be embracing innovation in our trade policy, and that's what we're doing. And that's why when you say FTA, sure, if by FTA you mean, are we innovating trade agreements and are we doing trade aggressively but in new ways? Yes. When you say FTA, if you mean the old style trade agreements that we used to do, then no.
We have to talk about climate. It's been a priority of President Biden from the beginning of the Biden administration. You've said that trade does have a role in that, in climate. We've just been experiencing COP28. What specifically can you do in trade with respect to that? Let me be more pointed than that. Why don't we have a carbon adjustment tax? That's something that we've heard favorable things, even from President Biden about.
Yeah.
Democrats had a proposal, didn't go forward.
Yeah.
Why don't we just do that?
Okay, so first, trade has to be part of the solution. Why aren't we there yet? And I would say, you're talking to the wrong person. That question needs to go to the US Congress. Tax policy, who writes the tax policy? It's not that we have no role, don't get me wrong, but we each have our respective roles as prescribed by our founding document, which is the US Constitution. With respect to tax policy, that is absolutely the jurisdiction of the United States Congress. We have to have that congressional, legislative, revenue outlook and consensus, or at least a basis, before I can do anything appreciably meaningful in trade. That is true for climate. It is also true for digital.
Congress gets to decide ultimately. Is the Biden administration pressing actively for a carbon adjustment tax?
Are we pressing aggressively for a carbon adjustment tax?
I mean, it's been known to happen that the White House proposes things to Congress to get them to enact it.
Well, you should, if John Podesta is still in the building, you should ask him to come back and ask him that question. Let me go back to your original question, which is, what are we doing with respect to trade and climate? The most important thing that we have been doing, another of our innovative trade initiatives has been the negotiation of a global steel and aluminum arrangement with Europe. So we have had Section 232 global tariffs on our steel and aluminum imports. The Biden administration's perspective is, with respect to global overcapacity and global market distortions in steel and aluminum, that is a fact that we have to contend with. We have to be able to be a steel producer. in the global economy, including for national security reasons, but also for basic economic reasons. But we shouldn't be taking that on alone. The distortions that are happening in the global marketplace are happening to our partners too. So we joined forces with the Europeans to say, let's figure out how we can liberalize and normalize trade between us on steel and aluminum, but work together to defend our economies against unfair trade and unfair production and create incentives for cleaner trade and cleaner production. It also is helpful that the Europeans have put forward and are rolling out a carbon border adjustment mechanism that covers 5 or 6 sectors, very carbon intensive industrial sectors that include steel and aluminum. That is what we've been working towards. We gave ourselves 2 years. We realized this fall that we're going to need more time. And we are committed in the Biden administration on behalf of the United States to staying at the table and working on this issue with Europe because it is so important. And it is foundationally important to creating a template for what we might do more broadly.
We have time for one more question, and I want to have it be on Africa. Okay. It's something that's important overall, and I know it's important to you.
Yes.
Where are we right now with Africa and trade?
So I think that next week will be the 1-year anniversary of the President Biden's African Leaders Summit, which we hosted last year in December. At the conclusion of that summit, President Biden gave an instruction to all of us in his administration, which is build partnerships with Africa, with the continent, with the countries, with the regions. Mm-hmm. And each one of us was encouraged to go to Africa early, often. I've been to the continent twice this year. One trip in July was to Kenya. We are negotiating another one of our innovative trade arrangements with Kenya. The other one was last month to Johannesburg when South Africa hosted the AGOA Forum. The AGOA Forum is the trade program that we have with sub-Saharan Africa. These engagements and these exercises that I've been involved in are to pursue an enhanced, robust, new approach to a U.S.-Africa economic partnership that helps us harness and develop the potential of Africa to be the economic engine that drives growth in this next period of globalization. But in order to do that, we're going to need to figure out how to do it differently. We're going to need development models that are more effective and more successful for both sides of the equation. And I'm very, very excited by what we're doing.
Madam Ambassador, thank you so much for your time. Really great to have you here. That's Catherine Tai, U.S. Trade Representative.
Thank you so much, David.
Thanks, Thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to do something unprecedented.